I don't think I've ever told anyone this story before, other than to reminisce with close friends on the accounts of what happened that night. This happened in July of 2015. And here's some background. My name is Chris. I stand at a ridiculous 6'7", and I did heavyweight boxing in high school. My best friends, Vincent and Brandon, are also tall and did some sort of sport in high school that required tough physical stamina. I can't remember exactly what it was. So we all love nature, and one weekend following our graduation, we decided that we would go out on a week-long camping trip up in the mountains. I knew of a spot near my granddad's cabin up in the Appalachians, in a valley right in between two enormous mountains. Imagine the Sound of Music kind of valley. So once we got packed, the three of us piled up into my pickup truck and headed off. 5 hours go by until I passed my granddad's cabin, and we continued going down the trail for another hour until we pulled up to the opening of the valley. The sun had since set, and the sky was a watercolor of pink and scarlet. We bailed out of my truck and began setting up camp. Now, due to the immense population of black bears and coyotes, we all came armed. I had packed my Mossberg Maverick Model 88 12 gauge with 2 3/4 Remington slugs and Federal Arms buckshot, more than enough firepower to stop an aggravated bear. I had parked my truck with the front end facing the entrance, while the truck bed end faced the valley. Our tent was facing directly in front of the truck bed. We had 3 chairs facing just outside of the tent, with the fire pit about 7 feet from the entrance of it. We also had 3 tiki torches lit up, setting up our basic boundaries of our site. It was about 11:30 at night, and we had just finished eating a campfire meal, and we were sitting around the campfire. I didn't have to worry too badly about getting firewood since I had packed my truck bed with plenty of it. I kept casually tossing in firewood until our fire had gotten nice and warm. About 20 yards to the left and right of us, there are thick woods surrounding our site. While we were sitting around, talking about anything and everything, our conversation was suddenly interrupted by strange noises of branches cracking and incredibly large footsteps crunching through the deep underbrush. We stayed quiet and listened carefully until it gradually dissipated. We brushed it off, thinking it had to have been a bear or some other sort of curious animal. It was about midnight when the noises started up again. We sat there in silence, and before long, we all reached for our guns and sat there. I grabbed my spotlight from the toolbox of my pickup truck and shined the bright light towards the wood line. There, standing just inside of it, were 2 massive red eyes. They almost looked like they were giving off their own incandescent glow. Judging from the height, I had to say the eyes were at least 7 feet off the ground. Vince and Brandon saw the eyes as well, and we stayed completely quiet. Eventually, though, Vincent couldn't help but ask, "What the hell is that?" His voice was shaky. "I have no fucking idea," I said, staying quiet. We all made sure our firearms were loaded, and we waited. My light drifted, and I caught another set of eyes. They were just as tall, if not slightly higher than the others. I took the light off of them and shuddered, not wanting to risk possibly attracting a bear, or whatever it was, watching us. We stayed cautious, but eventually turned in for the night. Nothing really happened most of that night. Fast forward 3 days and nothing interesting or crazy really happened, and we stayed pretty busy, practicing shooting and doing some hiking. The next night, however, that's when everything went down. We had just finished doing some target shooting and were coming back to our campsite. The sun was setting, and we had made it back just before dusk. We had gotten a fire going and were sitting around when, out of nowhere, a branch about as long as my leg came tumbling over our heads and landed about 3 feet away from us. We all ducked and got down and aimed all of our guns at the direction of where the stick came flying out of. It came from the exact direction that we had seen those eyes 3 nights ago. We stayed there, quietly waiting for anything to happen. Then, and I cannot lie about this, we heard the most blood-curdling, god-awful sound I think I had ever heard in my life. It was like a roar, a shriek, and cry all at once. I still have nightmares thinking about it. I trembled and whispered to Vince, "What in God's name was that?" He shrugged it off and also whispered, "Should we fire a shot?" Brandon beat him to it and fired, the sound of it bursting bouncing off the valley walls. We sat there stunned, quietly waiting for any sound that came. Then boomed another screech, louder than the first one. From the bush emerged a massive creature. It was completely covered in thick, blackish-brown fur. His shoulders were broad, as in about 5 feet across. It had to have been 8 to 9 feet tall, but his face was completely devoid of hair, and what I could only describe as what a caveman would have looked like. We just stared at it, completely shocked and positively terrified. We shouted at it, thinking it might understand us. "Hey, what are you doing?" It stayed quiet, but watched us menacingly. The thing made a single step, and Vince fired another round. The creature stopped. It then proceeded to move back into the woods. We then, rather quickly, packed all of our shit up, and all piled up as quickly as we could back into my pickup. I floored it out of there. While I drove, I saw something that I can easily say scarred me for the rest of my life. That thing was keeping up with us. I was going at least 30 miles per hour down that path, and that thing had no damn problem keeping up with us. I could see it from the reflection of my fog lamps. Its hair was blowing in the breeze while it kept up to my speed. I tried going faster, attempting to drive down that god-awful gravel path. I pulled out past my grandfather's cabin and hit asphalt, skidding onto the road. I looked from my rearview mirror and watched as that thing stopped at the asphalt. It watched us as we snaked our way out of the vicinity of the woods. After that, we drove for 6 hours straight, not stopping until we hit a gas station out in the middle of bumfuck nowhere. We stayed there until the sun had risen just above the mountains, and ever since then, I have not went back, not even to the cabin. We have also not gone camping ever since. The following story happened to my aunt at the countryside of Amazonas, Brazil. The whole region is known to own a lot of lore, of course, as it was natives' land, and a lot of this lore got mixed with Christian and European culture, creating a strange, colorful, and vivid amalgam of weird legends and degenerated beliefs in each independent village. Boogeyman stuff, I used to think, but now, things made me think twice before mocking old stories of ghosts and goblins. When I was a child, this tale was told on all occasions when family was together, transmitted orally from member to member, old to young, to keep the family aware of things that lurk in the dark. And now, I share it with you and you night watchers. In this story, the names are real, of real people, almost all of them dead now, and maybe they'll not bother with it. Maybe, I hope. In the 80s, all my family was committed to make money by plantations. We had a lot of them, guarana, cattle, coffee, and fishing. But Uncle Kazuza wanted to have a cocoa grove. At the time, the national production of cocoa was at its peak, and made sense to invest in one. But he needed a large, wet, and descending land to crop the cocoa. After a month or two in searching, he finally found a piece of excellent land for a very cheap price. At the time, it was about 5,490 Brazilian cruzados. That was the Brazilian money at the moment. Now this amount was worth maybe 200 reais. What is about less than $100. It was very cheap, and the riparians seemed very eager to leave. He said to my uncle that his daughter was sick at the capital, and he needed money for her treatment. So he was happy to sell the land, and the deal was done. 6 months later, Uncle Kazuza and Aunt Lily were living inside the cocoa grove, and the grove was almost mature and ready for the harvest. They were happy with the place and the neighborhood, which consisted of one single fisherman family who lived across the stream. The name of the old fisher lady was Nazare, and her husband's name is lost in time. Maybe we'll never remember it, so from now on we'll just call him the fisherman. As a true man of the Amazon rainforest, and still with hot Portuguese blood running in his veins, my uncle's hobby was to hunt, and the Amazonian woods had plenty of prey. tapirs, pacas, that is a little mammal, very tasty by the way, and birds and hearts. One night, Uncle Kazuza went to the fisherman's house and proposed a hunt. The rainy season was afoot and would be impossible to cross the river and buy victuals on Manos, the main city, so they would just hunt, smoke, and salt the meats and stock them. The fisherman agreed but was worried about his wife, who happened to be really old and fragile. He himself was way older than my uncle. He had experience and, most important, knew the area. The fisherman claimed that his father was the first white to live at that part of the Amazon River. Being said, Uncle Kazuza believed him and trusted him. It's always best to hunt at night in the Amazon. Despite the legends of ghost Indians and forest spirits, the animals are all sleeping and just the predators are out. The biggest worry was to find a jaguar. They are very vicious and ferocious in the Amazon. They can grab you and not leave a trace of blood. They are also very good swimmers and will try to kill you near water so you can't run. I think that the jaguars from Amazon learned that behavior from the old tribes around. As the men were hunting, their two wives, Aunt Lily and Nazare, stayed at home, sewing and chatting. The hunt would last at least 2 days, so they were very relaxed and talkative. Around 10 at night, the dogs started to bark at the cocoa groves. Even though there were fences around the cocoa grove that kept out animals and occasional thieves, the women started to get scared. They didn't have any means of protection, and Nazare, being old, could not fight off a thief. Aunt Lily stood up and started to close the house, all the doors and windows secured. But it was a simple house, mostly built with the products of land, wood, and straw. The brick walls could hold a menace, but the windows were made of wood and straw, easy to trespass even with bare hands. The dogs kept barking, and a weird, loud sound started to come from the cocoa grove. My aunt was in total despair and ran to the kitchen to grab a knife or something, and over the barks, they heard a distinct sound of footsteps. But not human. Definitely not human. Whatever it was big and came from the cocoa grove. Nazare stood up in the little living room. The women could hear the thing stomping over the cocoa trees and the fence. The dogs stopped barking, and now they were crying in fright, as if the devil was hunting them. Suddenly, the straw window opened wide, and a bright light like a torch or an eye entered the house. Aunt Lily used to say that it was like the noon sun inside the house. She fell on the floor and started to scream. Nazare was screaming too, begging the thing to go away. And suddenly she yelled, "Pray, Bepin. Grab a Bible and pray." But Aunt Lily answered, "I don't know, I remember nothing." The thing invaded the little house with its cold flames, not hot, only bright and blinding. A big ball of yellow light, but not bright yellow, but feverish like catarrh. The old woman stood up and started to yell the credo, an old prayer to shelter yourself from evil spirits. The voice was so loud, my aunt says that all the house was vibrating and the dogs kept barking. Nazare screamed all sorts of prayers and laments to God towards the creature. The thing started to twinkle and vanish. The sound of steps restarted. Slowly and slowly the straw window closed until all the light dimmed, jotting all the rooms in a soft darkness. And Lily could hear the thing going away, back to the cocoa groves. The sound of steps very far now. The dogs ran after it. None of them came back. After a week, Uncle Kazuza left and came back to Manos to work with my grandpa. To this day, the land and cocoa groves are still our property, but no one lives there. In the early 90s, my mom started to rent the place for parties and events, and then to build a house to host parties. But nothing ever lasted. Only the cocoa remains. I think that whatever is there was preventing the men to steal the fruits of the land, as the old Indians would say, because we don't need them. They were the product of our greed. After all of these events, my uncle remembered of the riparian and what he said about the treatment of his daughter. But if he needed so much money, why would he sell that excellent and fertile land for such a small price? He must have known about the thing that roams the cocoa groves. But what was it? For years this question haunted us. Aliens maybe, or some kind of natural spirit. I don't know, and part of me wants to discover. Sometimes when I'm going to the countryside, I pass in front of the wet, descending land. One day all of this will be mine, and I'll have to do something with it. Rent, build a house or a plantation. I'm thinking about a cane field, but definitely not corn. We all know that corn attracts even weirder shit.
Back in the mid-90s, I would run tree limbs along a long winding road in the backwoods of Kentucky in my old Ford pickup. Growing up there, I heard countless stories of strange things. These stories were usually your typical creature-in-the-woods sightings. But for my 30 years of living there, at the time, not once had I seen anything strange. And believe me, I drove through and worked in the woods on a daily basis. I was so sure that if I was going to see something weird, I would have already seen it. I was dead wrong. We were finishing up loading some tree limbs into my pickup. The last part of the day was packing in the wood and driving it cross-county. I loved it. The scenery was beautiful. I get to listen to my music, and just being alone with my thoughts was nice. That evening, as the sun set above the tree line, I was just passing an old wide pasture. In the distance on the road ahead of me, I could see a large black mound on the side of the road, just next to the barbed wire fence separating the road from the pasture. I slowed down as I got closer. I was in no hurry, and my curiosity got the better of me. As I got closer, the sight of the thing made me a bit nervous. Of course, driving up on the dead body of an animal would make anyone nervous, right? On the side of the road, a black cow lay dead. Its eyes bulged from their sockets as flies repeatedly landed and flew from its cornea. I drove up a little closer. It was a little morbid of me, but I wanted to know what might have killed the thing. There were tufts of fur hanging from some of the barbs on the fence beside it, as if the thing had tried to run through or jump over it. As for the body, I couldn't find any marks or blood. Maybe it died of a heart attack. Maybe something had chased it. Mischievous dogs and coyotes were rampant in these parts after all. I put the truck back in drive. Before I could push down on the accelerator, I heard a thud. My truck suddenly jounced back and forth. Something had fallen into the bed of my pickup. Immediately, I turned toward my back window. The sun had almost completely set by this time, and I couldn't make out much, save for the red-tinted bark of the branches closest to the glass, highlighted ominously by the brake light. I waited, still staring into the bed. I had heard something. Searching with my eyes, I could not find anything out of place. Then, my eyes locked onto something I didn't recognize. It looked like a patch of grass or fur. I could see its follicles catching in the wind. For a moment, I thought it may have been grass and soil we may have pulled up while throwing in the branches. When whatever it was attached to lifted itself up and stood on two legs, I feared for my life. But I could not help but watch in wonder and horror as this thing leaned forward, revealing itself in the faint red brake light. Yes, my foot was on the brake this whole time. In the 3 or so seconds that I watched this thing loom ever closer to my rear window, I made out exactly what I was looking at. The creature, and it was definitely no man. It was covered in dirty, matted fur from head to toe. Its legs didn't bend the way a human's do. They looked bent or twisted at the knees. Toward its upper body, the fur grew thin to the point I could see skin underneath, and its face. Oh God, it made my skin crawl. It looked both human and beast at the same time. All at once, my fear got the best of me. Without looking, I stomped the gas pedal on the floor. The truck took off, and I watched the creature jump out of the bed and land in the middle of the road, unscathed by the sudden acceleration. It just stood there, a silhouette growing dark in the distance. The damn thing had to have been at least 6 feet tall. It towered over the barbed wire fence on the side at the road. I have no idea what happened that night. I can easily tell you that my drives through that area are no longer fun. As I pass through that pasture, I feel like I'm being watched, and I can't help but drive a little faster when I'm in that area. Did that dead cow have anything to do with my experience? I feel like this creature had set me up, like it had laid a trap for me. Maybe I'm overthinking it. I wish I never would have stopped. Never have I been so afraid, especially in the place that has been my home all my life. I hope to God I don't break down on that road. About 2 years ago, in a small town in Arizona, I was staying with my grandparents because my family and I were moving, but we needed a place to stay for a few months. It was a typical stormy night with very loud and hard wind, making the mobile home shake and groan. My family was going to my cousin's mission calling in Utah. However, I stayed home because I was sick, literally feeling under the weather. I was sitting in the living room watching 90s kids cartoons, and then I suddenly heard a knock on the door. That was odd, considering it was 10 at night, and my grandparents only get visits from older people, which I was sure would never be up this late. Anyway, I went into the kitchen and looked out the window over the sink, looking onto the porch. No one was there. I thought to myself that this was probably just the wind. I sat back down, but then heard someone call my name. It was my grandma's voice. I had heard of skinwalkers before, how they were known for imitating human voices. There were stories from my Navajo friends that they had seen some around here before. But me being the dumbass I was, I just sat there and waited for something else to happen. It could have just been my imagination, right? As I waited, I heard another rasp at the door. I slowly made my way to the door, while constantly looking behind me. When I opened it, nothing was there. I slammed the door and ran back to my chair. My grandparents had guns, but kept them locked up in their room. I was screwed. I waited another 20 minutes for anything else, but nothing happened. My uncle stopped by to check on me after I had fallen asleep, and he had said that there was a fox in the yard. I never stayed there alone, ever again. Not even when I visit to this day. My name is Adrian, and I was 13 when this story happened. Me and my other friend, also 13, got bored and decided to take a walk through the woods before the sun set. It took us about 15 minutes to reach our fort we had made. The forest was super dense, and the woods were often dark even when the sun was out, so it was always a little spooky to be out there. After we had reached our little fort, he and I had been talking about comics and toys for a while, and didn't keep track of time. All of a sudden, we had a strange feeling of dread overcome us. We tried to feel safe because we were at a fort we had made a long time ago that we always went to. It was in a really big tree. We call it the tree because it's the largest, oldest oak around, and it's hard to miss. Then we heard the talking, very faint talking. And after a bit, we started to make out things like, "Come here," and "Help," in a very odd, raspy voice. Again, we shrugged it off, and I didn't realize until I had checked my watch that it was 5 minutes until sunset. We were having a good time at our fort, so we decided to stay. But we heard the noises again. This time they were louder, and an almost spot-on impersonation of me and my friend, but slightly deep and raspier. We were both hearing it loud and clear now, and decided it was really time to head back. We heard rustling and louder voices, and they sounded closer and closer every second. I heard right above me the phrase, "Help me," in a really croaky and raspy voice. I had asked my friend where the hell it came from. I asked him in a very concerned voice, but he just stood there, still, eyes wide open, staring above us. He let out a blood-curdling scream, and we both hit the ground running. He shouted, "On the tree!" I yelled back mid-pace, "Which tree?" I had no idea what was going on. Above me, I heard breathing, and I smelled a mix of what smelled like morning breath and blood, and somehow I felt hot breath on me. I couldn't help but stop, frozen still. I shook it off and ran harder than before, quickly catching up to my friend. I ran for 15 minutes straight, all the way home, and my lungs were on fire. I didn't realize how tired and out of breath I was until I finally stopped running. I was just lucky to get away. As soon as we got home, I had asked him what he saw. But every time I would ask, he would black out for a moment and start staring, and when he snapped out of it, he would tell me something like, "Shut up," or "It doesn't matter." To this day, he hasn't told me, and I've never mentioned it again, and we haven't been back to our fort. I could only imagine what was there with us in those woods, and I'm thankful we got away.
So this happened to me when I was about 6 years old. It was my first paranormal experience, and let me assure you that it was by far the most traumatic. Nothing I have experienced since then has topped this encounter. Back in 1999, I lived in Midland, Texas. My brother and I had been playing in the living room during a really bad thunderstorm at night. I have no idea where our 3 younger siblings were, asleep I'm guessing. My mother was in the kitchen washing dishes and singing. As we were playing and running around, I remembered I had homework to do. I told my mom I needed to get my backpack out of the car, then headed to the door that went into the garage directly behind her. She just nodded and kept singing her songs. As I headed through the door, she told me to be sure to close the door behind me. I said okay, and headed into the garage. As soon as I shut the door behind me, I got this sudden rush of fear. It was raining really hard, and the thunder and lightning echoed in our garage. So I'm 6, I'm in the garage alone, and it's dark and rainy outside. So of course, any kid would be scared. Logical, right? Our garage was the automatic kind and had windows at the top. I kept my eyes facing our car because I was afraid I'd see a monster if I looked out the windows. I opened the car door, hopped inside, and started making my way to the very back of the car to grab my purple Pocahontas backpack. As I was making my way, the fear I was feeling intensified, and the atmosphere started to feel really uneasy, like I was in danger. It was weird and hard to explain, but it seemed like every second that passed, the uneasiness grew. I kept my eyes looking down, grabbed my backpack, and started to pick up the pace to get out of the car and back in the house. I hopped off, slammed the door shut, and started speed walking to the door. Right as I was about to grasp the door handle and make it back to my sanctuary, there was a knock behind me. I panicked, and I don't know why, but I quickly turned to see who was there. It was my dad. Let me give you a little backstory about my dad. At the time, he used to be a truck driver and would be gone for weeks at a time and home for a few days because he was a workaholic. So all we could do was have short phone conversations with him because it was back when you had to buy minutes and they were expensive. When he would come home, it was always hugs and kisses when we saw each other and lots of "I love yous." He may have been gone a lot, but when he was home, he was an amazing dad and would take us everywhere, our favorite place being Discovery Zone. He would chase us through the tunnels and ball pits. When he would arrive home, or we would go pick him up at the truck stop, he always had his sunglasses on and his army bag over his shoulder, holding it by the straps. That is exactly who I saw standing on the other side of the garage window. My dad, with sunglasses on, and his right hand holding the straps of what I assumed would be his army bag of clothes. I let out a sigh of relief. "Oh, it's just you, Dad," I thought to myself, and the biggest grin came across my face. The atmosphere remained the same, but when I saw my dad, the fear eased. But he didn't smile at me like he usually did, after being away from home for a long time, and he didn't speak. He looked emotionless. He then began pointing with his left hand. No smile, no emotion, only pointing to something. I started looking for what it was. I pointed to a box in the floor. The box? I asked. He shook his head as if to say no, and kept pointing. I pointed to several other things, and he patiently mentioned a no every time. He just kept pointing. Finally, I looked above me beside the door behind me, the green glowing button, the one that opened the garage. I pointed to it and looked at him. "The button?" I asked. He nodded his head in approval and motioned for me to push the button. I was about to do it, and suddenly the feeling of danger and fear came back, even more overwhelming than the first time. Something was wrong, really wrong. A voice in my head told me not to open the garage. I looked at Dad, so afraid I couldn't speak anymore. I shook my head, declining to push the button. He motioned again, this time aggressively. And again I declined. This time my eyes started to water up. He then put his pointing hand down and stared at me for what felt like forever, but couldn't have been more than 10 seconds. His expression changed from apathetic to angry. He just stared at me, and I stared back, paralyzed with fear. Then he lifted his hand back up, but it wasn't a hand anymore. They looked like claws. I remember him scratching the window and hearing it screech like nails on a chalkboard. I was finally able to snap out of my paralyzed state to run inside. I don't actually remember running inside. All I recall is turning around to get in and next just sitting on the couch, traumatized. My brother knew something was up because I had been all shits and giggles with him earlier. He grabbed my shoulder and gave me a light shake. "What's wrong, Vanessa?" I don't even think he got to finish that question before I started screaming my head off and having a panic attack. My mother dropped what was in her hand and came running to my screams of bloody terror. My brother gave my mom an "I didn't do it" look, and she bent down beside me asking what was wrong. I could barely speak through my sobbing. All I could say was, "Daddy is scaring me." She couldn't understand what I was trying to say and asked, "Where?" I pointed to the garage, and she stormed off in that direction. I cried for her not to go, afraid the monster would get her. She came back in, saying there was no one there. After I was able to calm down, I told her what had happened and started the sobbing process all over again, since I was reliving this moment. She called my dad. He was 435 miles away in Houston, Texas. Nowhere near us. They spoke for a bit more, and she handed me the phone. My dad prayed with me and told me to never be afraid, to just call upon Jesus to help me, and that the bad things wouldn't bother me again. I slept with my mom that night. Here's the disturbing part. The next morning, she went out to check the garage. There were claw marks on that window. I think before she thought it was just my imagination, a kid just afraid of the dark and a thunderstorm, until the scratches proved otherwise. We moved lots of times since then, and we now live in a different city. I'm 22 now. I haven't been able to go into the garage at night alone until a few years ago, but I can't be in a room where the mini blinds or curtains are open at night. My heart begins to race, and my breathing becomes unsteady. It still scares me to think about that night. I still have all these unanswered questions. Why was it wearing sunglasses at night? Why did it happen to me? And the scariest question I asked myself, what would have happened if I had opened the garage? I've seen quite a few things that I have a hard time explaining. In case I submit any others, I'll just give you some background information for now. My father served in the military. He was descended from a Native American tribe from up north, was a survivalist, and a complete sociopath. He would often force his sons into intense survival scenarios and then left us for weeks on end to see if we'd survive. I've seen some truly disturbing things during these camping trips and some things in less stressful settings. Anyway, I'll get on with this sighting. I was 11. I had just moved back to America less than a week before. My family had decided to take a short road trip up to Maine to visit some family when we went off course. Being 11 and naive enough to think I would actually make it to Maine before my father did anything stupid, I didn't pay attention to when he pulled off onto a back road. To this day, I did not know where I was dropped off at, just that it was in a dense, forested area. I think it was in New York, but I can't say for certain. Before I knew it, I was kicked out of the car, handed my canteen, a bow, a compass, a quiver, and a knife. I was told that they'd be back after visiting family, and I'd have 15 days out there. I did the basic survival things. I found drinkable water. I built shelter, plotted out a rough map of the area in my head. All of those sort of things that I had learned growing up. It was my third or fourth night there, when I heard what sounded like a woman screaming. Since mountain lions didn't come out this far east, and bears were easy to scare away if it was one, I figured that I'd go investigate, in case it was an injured hiker or something. After following the sound, all I could find was a squirrel that was partially eaten. Since the screaming had stopped, I figured that someone had come across the nasty sight while they were hiking, and ran off or calmed down and went back to hiking. So I went back to my shelter and settled in for the night. After that, though, the screaming became a nightly occurrence, and after the third night of not finding anything aside from the evidence of a predator in the area, I decided to play it safe and stay in my shelter at night. 2 days before my family would be back, where I was dropped off at, I woke up in the middle of the night to screaming right outside my shelter. I jumped out, terrified, bow in one hand, my knife and an arrow in the other. What I saw terrified me. It had to have been about the size of a dog, but shaped more like a deer, and had a very humanoid face though, and was covered in dull, black scales. I panicked, and I shot the thing in the chest. It began hissing and wheezing as it ran off into the trees. I had thought about following it and killing it, but when I looked at its tracks, I saw something that convinced me otherwise. The creature's hind legs left behind the tracks of a small deer. The front legs, however, left the tracks you'd see from a person walking on their hands like a gorilla. Only the fingers ended with sharp claw marks scratching up the earth while it moved. I didn't sleep at all the rest of that night, and on the following morning, I dug several holes around my camp and filled them with sharpened sticks and stakes, and I covered them. I also did some squirrel hunting and harvested berries as fast as I could once my defenses were up, so that I wouldn't need to worry about losing my strength if that thing came back. It didn't that night. Not that I got any sleep anyway. In the morning, I just carved a simple warning into the trees around my camp that just said, "Danger, traps," and I left. I didn't let go of my bow until after I was picked up, and we had been driving for over an hour. I honestly don't know what I saw, or if the light had been playing tricks on me, but I know that I did hear something screaming that night, and I know what I saw on the tracks of that creature. I just know that I heard something screaming, and that I know I saw those devilish tracks. The story I'm going to tell needs a little foundation. I was 15 the year this happened. I'm Native American, and I live in northern Nevada in a rural area, so I grew up near animals and the outdoors. I was also a Boy Scout, so I knew how to identify most of Nevada and Idaho's wildlife. But the story I'm going to tell you just ruined the outdoors for me. Every time I go camping or hunting, I will think of this. Every time I smell garbage or a skunk, I think of this. When this happened, I was hunting with my brother, my 2 uncles, and my dad. We were going on a 3-night hunting trip. Where we were going had rivers, valleys, canyons, cliffs, and forests. It was on the edge of the woods in a valley. It was our annual campsite. In the valley was a river that cut through the middle of it. and ran into a natural lake that held trout, bass, and white fish. When we had nothing to do, we would spend our time swimming or fishing. The water was cool and clear and attracted a lot of wildlife. I once watched a mountain lion and her cub drink from the water. I heard all these stories about mountain lion attacks, but they are timid and shy. It was the second evening when we were sitting by the campfire joking and laughing when we smelled a very putrid odor. It smelled like a garbage dump on a warm day. It sort of smelled like a skunk. But then my uncle said in a scared and serious tone, "Let's go into the camper." I went inside like he said, laid down and went to sleep. It must have been around 1:30 in the morning when I woke up to our trailer rocking in the same odor that we smelled earlier. I was confused. At first I thought it was a cow or something pushing its head against the side of the trailer. Then I remembered the look on my uncle's face and it sent chills down my spine. I tried to go back to sleep when I heard footsteps on the roof of the camper. I had to go use the bathroom, so I grabbed my .22 250 and slowly opened the door. I glanced around for a little bit, then I took off for the side of the camper. I stopped and looked at the roof. There was a black figure that was crouched down and staring right at me. I was scared to death, so I fired a round into the air to scare it off. It hopped from the position onto the ground and bolted for the tree line. When it got there, it looked back and let out the ugliest, most blood-curdling cry I've ever heard, and I wish I will never hear that cry again. I still go hunting in those woods, but I've never went overnight or near that spot again. So I don't know if this was some kind of creature or just someone pulling a prank on me, but either way, it terrifies me to this day. I am 17 now, but this story happened when I was between 7 to 10 years old. I've experienced sleep paralysis before, and this was not the same thing. I woke up after having a nightmare, which I had almost every night when I was younger, but every time I woke up from one, I would lay in bed for a while. After about 10 minutes, I decided it was time to get up and get ready for school. As I turned my head toward my window being about 5 feet tall, I saw something walking back and forth outside my window. It was very short and was kind of slow. I laid there for about a minute, trying to figure out what that was. I thought it was my brother messing with me when he took my dog out, so I decided to get up and look out of my window. But right when my feet touched the ground, it stopped right in the middle of my window, like it heard my bed creak. Then it looked around for a few seconds, then stood up and started walking back and forth again. Right when it did, I realized that this was not my brother. At that time, my brother was getting close to 6 feet tall and he was 15. This thing was 5 feet tall at most and was very skinny and bony. I was too terrified to move. After about 5 more minutes of this thing just walking back and forth, it disappeared. It never came back, and I finally realized how fast my heart was beating. I eventually got the courage to move, so I walked into my kitchen and saw my mom and brother getting ready. I asked them if they saw anything, or if they had been outside walking around, but they both answered no. I have no idea what I saw that day, but I'd prefer not to see it again.
I want to start off by saying all of this happened in 2011 in Siberia, Russia, very thickly wooded. I am going to relay as much info as possible without giving any info on mission objectives at the time. You may be wondering why there were Americans in Russia, but that is a question I'd rather not answer. At the time, I was in the Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command, or MARSOC. Beginning the story, my team was split up into 2 squads at the time, into 2 groups of 7. We were to rally back up into a team at camp, so me and my squad of 6 were not expecting any resistance. We did not have our weapons drawn. Approaching a cliff with a couple 100-foot drop, we started surveying the area below and noticed the small town in the forest below that was not mapped. After calling it in, we were given an order to make our way to this town to investigate. As we hiked, we noticed the trail along the ridge that would double time to the bottom of the cliff and made the decision to take it. After we were halfway down the trail, we heard a bellowing howl above us that almost made me lose balance. It didn't sound like a wolf at all. We looked back up the trail and we saw something that we could have mistaken for a human if it weren't for its arms that were touching the ground. The thing was at least standing 9 feet tall. When it was clear it had our attention, it moved back over the summit so that we could not see it. At this point, we had all drawn our weapons and started moving down the trail at a much faster pace. Once we were at the bottom and were back in the woods, I noticed that everything was silent except us crunching through the snow. We could see the small town now, but upon further inspection, all the houses weren't that I would call a house, more like shacks, some not even completely built, just half of a shack, and there was nobody in sight. We made our way into this town and noticed the recently put out fire pit and lots of blood and meat in some of the shacks. We called this in as well, and we were told to stay put until the other squad arrived, which wouldn't be until the next morning. So we made a fire in the fire pit that was there, and were all around the fire talking about pointless things, like another squad mate going to see his wife when back in home territory, when out of nowhere, the same howl came from just outside the light of the fire, so loud that I swear it could have shaken the rocks. Immediately, we were all up and had our weapons ready, hot-clicking on our beams, scanning the surrounding area, and seeing nothing when a huge rock hit the ground next to me. We take cover in a shack that was close, and another rock hit one of the walls and goes straight through. We were finally given the command to engage on sight and press where we think the rock came from. 3 of us flanked from around another shack and found nothing. Then we saw it. Or saw them, I should say. At least a dozen of the same thing we saw on the cliff, covered in white fur and long arms almost dragging the ground. They were huge. They were just standing there looking at us with black eyes like nothing I had ever seen. One of them making another howl and then turning and going back into the woods. The rest followed, and I wondered why we didn't fire. I looked over at my squad mates and they all had wide eyes just as me. We got command to pursue, and hesitantly we did. We walked into the dark forest, following the tracks we could see. When we heard another howl to our right, it was followed by the sound of someone yelling. As we all turned toward the noise, we noticed that one of us was missing. We immediately gave chase to where we thought he was taken, when we came to a blood trail. We followed suit as fast as we could. We caught a glimpse of something in front of us. As we got closer, we saw another one of those things with our squad mate in its hand. I quickly shot at least half of my magazine into it, and they both dropped with a thud. I rushed over to my squad mate and realized that he was almost decapitated. I became overwhelmed with a mixture of fear and anger. We grabbed our fallen comrade and returned to the town, setting up a perimeter. Needless to say, none of us got any sleep that night. After we returned to base camp the next day, we were given orders to never speak of it. My squad mate was written off as killed in action in Afghanistan. We were told these things are called Duke's Law. In English, this means spirit of evil. I'll never forget what happened, and I don't think any of the others will. We didn't find the dead thing's body, and honestly, I didn't care. I think I could say the same for the rest of us. We just wanted to get home and be safe.
Cabins are so creepy. I guess it's my fault, though, for letting myself get creeped out by something that's supposed to be a vacation getaway. But I can't help but think about all the dozens of stories I've read online about creepy experiences at cabins. I can say for sure that I never thought I'd experience something for myself. My friend Laura and I decided to go up to my grandma's cabin one weekend during the winter. The cabin was deep in the woods of North Dakota. It was a beautiful place. I often stayed there with my grandparents as a child. Now, I was in college, and it was time to relax after some pain-in-the-ass finals. The first night was exactly what I hoped it would be. We played video games, talked, and laughed. I spent the morning drinking coffee and reading a book on the couch. I wish I could spend every day like that. Well, it wasn't until night that things got a little weird. "Hey, Melissa." Laura called to me as she walked inside. She had just gone to the gas station in my Jeep to get some cigarettes. "What's up?" I asked. When I walked around the corner, I noticed she had entered through the front door backwards, keeping her eyes on something just beyond the glass of the door. "Do you see it?" she murmured. I almost didn't hear her. I leaned over and looked out of the living room window. All I saw was the snow-covered road that emerged from the woods and led up to the driveway. I don't see what... Before I could finish, a tall, dark silhouette stepped from the tree line by the road on the right and onto the road itself. It had a long stride. In 2 steps it had crossed nearly onto the other side of the road. It just stopped there. We could see it turning in every direction. "Who the hell is that?" You could hear the confusion in Laura's voice. "I have no idea. There's no cabins anywhere close to here. That gas station is the closest thing to us, and it's a 20-minute drive out." My mind was reeling. Who's the guy just standing there out in the driveway? The figure then turned back toward the tree line from which it had originated, and took 2 long steps. It disappeared quickly into the woods. I threw on my jacket and boots. Without a word, Laura did the same. We have always been a curious pair. Fear always came second to our curiosity. Maybe that's why I can read hours of scary stories. Anyway, we stepped out onto the driveway and headed toward the beginning of the road that entered the woods. The snow itself was at least 8 inches deep. As soon as we stood where that man was, we saw the tracks on the ground. Whoops. There were Obby's hoof prints on the ground like a ram or sheep had been walking around. We did not see anyone or anything but that man a few seconds ago. Unless he was walking a goat or something that was bleach white like the snow, there were no animals out there. We looked at each other and quickly walked back inside. Together, we sat on the couch and warmed ourselves with the fireplace. The TV played MTV something or other, but we both couldn't help but feel a little odd. Eventually, it escaped my mind, and I was able to fall asleep pretty easy. But loud stomping in the middle of the night forced me back to life. Thud, thud, thud. I couldn't make out where it was coming from, but it yanked me from my sleep. Droopy-eyed, I peeked out of the windows of my room. It snowed nightly outside, but I didn't see anyone out there. It must have been Laura stopping down the hallway to get a glass of water. She had never been very light-footed. Thud, thud, thud. The sound came again, and I knew immediately that the sound was not coming from within the house. Now wide-eyed, I got up with my blanket and headed toward the living room. It must have been a full moon that night, because the windows shone with quite a bit of light, enough that I could make out the details of the tree line through the windows. I stepped quietly into the living room. Laura was already there, kneeling behind the recliner with her face peeking over it. Before I could ask what the hell she was doing, a tall silhouette appeared behind the curtains of the window. Thud, thud, thud. Someone was on our porch. They walked back and forth from the door to the window over and over again. It looked like he was trying to peek through, trying to find a gap in the curtains. Instinctively, I darted over to the recliner and ducked next to Laura. "He's been there for the last hour," she whispered to me, even though I doubt he could hear us. Mouth open, I watched in horror as this figure walked around our porch, stomping far too loudly than I thought possible. I figured the boots or shoes of anyone would have crunched with all that snow. We didn't have an awning out there. Then he stomped back over to the door and started pounding with his fist. And I'm not talking violently knocking. He was trying to break down the freaking door. I couldn't keep myself from shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. That's when we heard the loudest, weirdest sounding scream. There's no way that was human. The scream literally lasted for the duration of a minute. 60 seconds at least of some otherworldly screech. As quickly as it started, it stopped. No stopping. No screaming. All but the howling of the wind had become silent. We didn't go back to our rooms, and we didn't go to sleep. We sat there together, hunched in the floor all night. As soon as daylight broke through those thankfully thick curtains, we packed up and left. I have no idea what we saw out there, but there were hundreds of footprints on our porch. There wasn't a single human footprint in the snow outside, save for our own. Whether that thing was human or not, I want to know one thing. Where the hell did those hoof prints come from?
I used to live in an old, run-down house on the edge of some suburbs near Houston, Texas. The place was ancient as well as oddly built. For example, the kitchen was also the laundry room, which also had the front door connected to it. The back door was on the second story because the place sat in the middle of a steep hill. Yeah, none of it really made much sense to me, but it was home for the whole of my childhood. That back door, though, it freaked me out. The fact that it was on the second story made it so creepy. If someone broke in up there, they'd only be yards away from my bedroom door. Not to mention its foggy window pane and the big weird flap that was cut out of the bottom of the door. It looked like a doggy door that one of the previous owners had cut into it. We, of course, nailed it into place since we don't have any pets ourselves. I must have been 5 years old when we moved in. It was pretty uneventful. When I wasn't at school, I was at home helping my mom and dad unpack boxes. It's insane how many boxes a person can fill with their personal items they've gathered over the years. Multiply that with each person living in our house, and you have the literal 40-hour work week of unboxing that the three of us had to do. A month in, everything looked great. It was finally starting to feel like home. But I direly missed our old house and friends back there. One night, after settling in bed for some well-needed rest, I heard something strange. It was a bumping sound, very subtle and without a pattern. Bump, 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 bumped. And I couldn't exactly tell where it was coming from, and I don't think it was coming from my room. I wasn't really creeped out at the moment, just curious, so I get out of my bed and put on my loafers. The house was absolutely freezing. My dad loved to take the thermostat down to 66 at night. He must have been a snowman. I opened my bedroom door, which led into the upstairs hallway. To my left was a spare bedroom and a utility closet, and to my right was the upstairs outside door, as we began to call it. Bump, bump. This time, I heard it more clearly. It was much louder than before. I turned to my right. Thumped. The upstairs outside door shook a little. Bump, bump. Every time the noise came, the door shook. It was like someone was outside, hitting the door. Hello? I called out. I don't know why I said anything at all. I can only assume that part of me was hoping someone was simply knocking, and part of me wanted to say something so that my parents may have heard me and come running upstairs. This time, fear began to settle in. I jumped with each bumping noise, with each shake of the door. I started to back up into my room. Then it was deathly quiet. I couldn't help but stop. The bumping had ceased. I waited for a few minutes. Still, the noise did not return. The night was quiet again. My heart froze when the shadow appeared beyond the faded glass of the door. Someone had just stood up, as if they were on their knees and suddenly decided to stand at attention. They patted at the door. I could hear nails click and clack on the wood. And then I smiled with relief. It was a dog. I could see its ears, and the movement and click-clack of nails was the distinct sound of a dog jumping up and scratching at a door. It must have been the neighbor's animal. Or maybe it was used to using the doggy door with the previous owners. I calmly walked back to bed and went to sleep. Now, this happened every night and at the same time for the next week. I think it occurred around midnight, and the bumping would start. It would always wake me up. but it started to become soothing, knowing that it was just a lonely dog who probably missed its former residence. Maybe a week after that night, something horrifying happened. The bumping came as it usually did. It woke me up and I tried to go back to sleep, but this time I heard a different noise. At first there was the usual bump, but it was followed by a cracking sound. Then came the scraping. It was extremely loud. I definitely couldn't go back to sleep with this noise. I got up and walked into the hallway. I flicked on the light switch that was right next to the outside of my bedroom door. I screamed at the top of my lungs. Writing this out, my body is covered in goosebumps and tears are welling up in my eyes. I know it may sound unbelievable, but the very reason I'm sharing this story is not for the sake of attention or to scare people. You should all know of the things that are out there. Just because you're human, just because you're an American citizen in the middle of the suburbs, doesn't mean that something terrifying and hungry doesn't have its eyes on you. What I saw that night will terrify me for the rest of my life. Believe me or not, whatever makes you sleep better at night, the flap to that doggy door lay in the floor, torn from its hinges. The nails that we had placed in it were scattered on the hard wood. A mass of jet black fur and snarling yellow teeth tore at the doggy door. Some creature, some animal, was trying to get inside. Then it looked up at me, staying still for a moment just to lock its eyes with mine. It looked like a dog, except its head was twice the size of a German Shepherd's. This was definitely no dog. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Then it suddenly went back to wrestling itself through the little door, biting and snapping in my direction. I could feel saliva land on my ankles from the creature's maw. At this point, I was taken aback, walking slowly backward away from that door. I believed without a doubt that this was either a massive wolf or bear trying to enter my home. The moment I saw its claws, I knew it couldn't have been either of those. It had fingers, long, reaching fingers, with grotesque nails on the tips. They were somehow even yellower than its pointed teeth. They scraped at the floor, shaving up pieces of wood as it tried to force its way in. I continued to scream. I couldn't speak tangible words. My whole body shivered. Jesus fuck! I heard my dad's voice. He was a few steps from the door on the staircase. He must have been running up the stairs when he saw it. "Casey, get over here," he yelled at me. I shook my head. The staircase started where the upstairs door was. Once he reached the top of the stairs, he could turn that doorknob and walk out. I was not going that close to the thing. Just stay there, I'm coming to you." He grabbed at the railing and scooted his way up the steps. As soon as he was at his closest point to the wild beast, it looked up at him and with angry eyes pulled away. My father took the chance. He ran to me, and we both watched the now still and quiet door together. The thing outside, and I'm not joking, it stood up. We watched as a blurry, dark silhouette towered over the door. It stood for a moment, then walked away. After a few moments, my dad took me to his room and told me to stay with my mother, who was sitting up, very confused in bed. He ran around the house, checking the doors and windows to make sure they were locked. He got his rifle, and we all stayed up in bed, waiting and listening. Nothing else happened that night, and my dad looked pale as a ghost. I never heard the bumping again. My parents decided to replace the door altogether. They even applied a deadbolt. Yet, ever since that night, my father acted strange, worried, even a bit guilty. Eventually, I asked him what was bugging him, and he finally told me. That night, when I checked the locks in the doors and windows, he gulped and sighed before he continued. The upstairs outside door was unlocked.
It all started after we moved into our new home. It was a great place with 3 bedrooms, a huge kitchen, a large family room, 4 bathrooms, and an attic room. I claimed the attic room myself the instant I set foot in the new place. It was rather large, with a huge vent about 6 feet where my bed was going to be. That didn't faze me, as I loved the feeling of the air conditioning on my body. When we were settled, which took about 2 days, our huge Persian Himalayan cat, Maud, claimed my room as hers as well. I swear that cat weighed 15 pounds at her lightest. These details will be relevant later. The weirdness began when I'd wake up every morning and see that the vent was slightly open, and Maud would be sitting at the foot of my bed, staring at the open vent, her tail twitching slightly. I didn't think much of it at first, as the AC had a ridiculously powerful fan that would send air blasting whenever it came on. But it happened every morning, the same scene greeting me every time I woke up. But on one stormy night, my perspective on the whole thing changed. A particularly loud clap of thunder awoke me. I reached to pet my cat for a little reassurance, but she wasn't there. I turned and saw her standing, not sitting as she normally was, at the foot of my bed. Her tail was bushy and her back was arched. Suddenly, she jumped back, hissed, and bounded onto my chest. She then turned her head toward the vent and began snarling and growling, making those angry meow, meow, meow noises. There was a huge flash of lightning, and I saw a tall, gangly-looking figure looming over my bed. I only saw it for a split second before it disappeared into that vent. As soon as it disappeared, Maud became her usually sweet self again, rubbing her head on my cheek. Somehow, I fell asleep after that, simply thinking it was just a weird nightmare, or even sleep paralysis. After that night, the vent was no longer open every morning, and I soon forgot that horrible night. But it didn't end there. 6 years passed after that night, and the unusual happenings had ceased, but I still had the feeling that I was being watched. So I shoved my dresser in front of the vent and put all manner of heavy objects on top of it so that it would be impossible to move. I thought I was safe from this thing invading my personal space, but I was very, very wrong. To quickly preface what I'm about to write, I must create a little context. My father had bought some guns after a series of robberies shook the neighborhood. He gave me his double-barreled shotgun to use in case of a break-in. On that fateful night, I was lying awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling and counting the roofing nails. I was just about to drift off when I heard a loud thud. I jumped and sat up. Thud. I could see our now old cat, arching, disappear under the bed. The noises became louder and closer together, and I could see in the darkness that my dresser was shaking violently with every hit. I reached under my bed and grabbed my gun, holding it at the ready. The dresser then fell on its front with a loud crack, and the vent fell with it. I heard a shuffling noise emerging from the vent, and I began to fumble for my lamp switch. I turned it on, and what I saw has haunted me to this day. There it stood, impossibly tall and thin, with long arms, legs, and a thin, spiky tail. Its hands and feet sported claws that were at least a foot long. And that horrible face. Its eyes were black, soulless, unblinking. Worst of all, though, it seemed to be smiling, revealing long, jagged teeth. It took a couple of steps toward me, its claws dragging on the floor. I jolted out of my trance and aimed the shotgun at its head. The thing's smile seemed to fall, as it seemed to realize that its victim was not at all defenseless. It whipped around and slithered into the vent, moving very quickly for something its size. I jumped off the bed and ran to the vent, aimed my gun, and pulled both triggers. The shotgun's thunderous discharge reverberated throughout the house, followed by a noise that I can only describe as a roaring screech, high-pitched, and yet also low in tone, if that makes any sense. That sound will stick with me for as long as I live. My parents, of course, came stampeding up the stairs, guns in hand, demanding to know just what in blue blazes was happening. I told them, but my dad just yelled at me for firing a gun in the house. I told him to shine a light down the vent, and he begrudgingly complied. His face paled. I followed his gaze and saw that there was blood everywhere on the walls of the vent. The bloody liquid wasn't red, but a blackish, greenish, bluish color. We looked out the window and saw something limping down the street and into the woods at the end of the road. Needless to say, we all slept in a hotel that night. It's been about 5 more years since that incident, and even now, I still feel as though I am being watched. Strangely, I have moved across the state, and I still have that feeling. Maybe I should sleep with my gun tonight. This is a short, but terrifyingly true experience that occurred when I was about 11 or 12 years old. I grew up on a Navajo reservation in Utah. Often, the older guys would go out to a nearby bluff to camp out. I was never allowed to go with them. They were grown-ups, my mother told me. I was just too young. But the older I grew, the more I wanted to go with them. So, one night, I snuck out and followed them out there. It was maybe a 30-minute walk out, and it took everything I had to be quiet enough to not get caught. After an excruciating walk, we made it to the bluff. It was beautiful at night. I had never been there after dark. There had to have been thousands of stars in the sky. It's crazy how different and beautiful everything seemed to be, merely half an hour away from my home. Well, now that I was there and the guys were setting up camp, I honestly had no idea what I was going to do. I never thought about it. Did I really expect to just wait out there all night and sleep in the nearby woods? So I decided, once they settled in, I'd make myself known and face the repercussions in the morning. I heard a twig snap behind me. My heart pounded, and I turned to face whatever was there. It was my older brother. I wanted to... I stammered for an excuse. He shushed me with a weird smile on his face. I turned back toward the group in front of me. My brother's friends were putting together a campfire, and my brother was pitching the... Wait. My older brother was setting up the tent, but he was also behind me? I immediately turned around. My brother, no, this impersonator, was now beside me, standing over the bushes as if he didn't care if the others saw him. He stared at the campsite. I was too afraid to move or scream. I sat there waiting and hoping this thing would go away. He was so close. Who knows what might have happened if I would have yelled for my real brother. I don't know why I glanced at his feet, but that's when I couldn't help but jump backward, away from the demon before me. He didn't have feet. He had hooves like a goat. I had heard stories of skinwalkers, even stories of the goat man. I thought they were just that, stories. But that night on my back on the ground, tears welling up in my eyes, I stared at a being that wasn't my brother. Nor was it human. I got up and ran harder than I thought I could, not caring whether that thing chased me or not. I ran until I gripped my older brother's waist in a tight hug. I could feel the guy's eyes on me, but at least I was away from that thing. They knew I was scared. I could hear them asking me why I was crying instead of wondering why I wasn't at home. They drove me home that night and never ratted me out. I never spoke of that night, not even with my brother. No one would believe me anyway. But even so, after all these years, I still can't help but wince whenever my brother smiles at me.
I live in Serbia. I was 17 when this happened. I was hanging out at a friend's house. There were 3 of us at the time. We got bored, so we decided to go to my friend's garage and work on his bike. It was getting late and a storm was approaching, so we decided to stay a little bit longer to fix his bike. When we were done, it was already midnight and the storm was upon us. We decided to go home, and my friend went to open the garage door. When he opened it, he screamed and immediately shut the door. He said that something was outside of the garage. Me and my other friend thought that he was only joking, so we went to open the door. But when we did, we realized that he wasn't playing around. There was something running toward the forest at the back of the house. It was tall, and it was running on 4 legs. It was hairless with white skin. The dog that was in the backyard was scared to death and couldn't move. We stood motionless as well. The creature disappeared in the forest. Without another word, I took off home as fast as I could. It was rainy and windy. My house was close, but I was still running scared of what I saw earlier. But that was not the last time I saw the thing. While running, I felt that something was watching me. I stopped and looked behind me. At the end of the street, that creature was standing and staring at me. I was so scared that I couldn't move. I felt like we were looking at each other for a solid hour, but it could only have been a few seconds. Then, the creature slowly went left towards the forest where it had been running earlier. I never spoke about that with my friends, and I hope that I will never see that thing again. This will be short but sweet. Well, it won't be sweet at all. This memory haunts me daily. I live in a very mountainous region in Colorado. I love going hiking in the snow, no matter how much snow there might be. I've been a passionate hiker since I was a teenager. One of these hikes, though, the snow seemed to be coming down hard. It's a gamble to hike during the snow. As soon as it seems to be getting rough, it's time to head back. So that's just what I did. But that day, when I did turn back to go toward the opening of the trail, a figure stood before me. It was about 5 feet tall, had dark, messy fur, and it smelled strongly of piss. I was taken aback when I saw it. The thing resembled a dark mountain goat, but I swear to you, this fucker was standing on its hind legs. I stared at it, bewildered, wondering if the thing had been following me this close the whole time. The thought freaked me out, to be honest. In a matter of seconds, the creature grunted and huffed at me, ran at a frightening speed toward me, and rammed its bent horns into my stomach. I feared for my life. At that moment, I thought I was dying. Instead of continuing the attack, instead of beating me to death, it stomped away in the snow, the same direction I had been heading before I turned back. I picked myself up and ran away. I also promised myself to never mention this to anyone in person. It is the most absurd story I've ever heard, but it happened to me.
I live in Utah, a state that is often overlooked when it comes to the paranormal. However, I can assure you that this state has had more than its fair share of strange happenings. From the Bear Lake Monster in the north, Skinwalker Ranch in the south, and even some Bigfoot sightings in the mountains. The one thing I never thought I would see was the fabled Chupacabra. This happened about 2 days ago, so I figured I would write this down while the encounter is still fresh in my mind. My friends and I were on a late-night drive through a canyon near Salt Lake City. We often go on these drives as there isn't much to do on a weeknight in SLC. We had just turned the corner when the headlights caught something across the road. At first I thought it was a coyote, as this thing was the same size and relative shape. However, as we got closer, I could see that it was walking strangely, almost as if it was hopping or galloping. Even more strange was the fact that it seemed to be missing a lot of hair. Now, I would be willing to accept that it was a coyote suffering from mange if it wasn't for what I saw next. It had abnormally large and powerful-looking hind legs, and when it turned to face the car, I saw long fangs protruding from its muzzle. After we safely exited the canyon, we were all a little shaken up and decided to call it a night. I won't be back to that canyon for a while. Number 6. Not too long ago, I lived in the middle of the woods on top of a hill. To get to my house, you had to drive up a long, winding dirt road, pass a couple of chicken houses, get out of your car to open a gate, drive through, then shut the gate, and drive up more dirt road with woods on all sides. It was worth it for the peace and beauty of the place, or so I thought. You see, as I was driving home one night after getting off work, I was dreading getting out of my car to open the gate. Everybody hated opening that gate. The only reason it was there was so that the local farmers' cows didn't get through and get lost in the woods just beyond it. So, tired and dirty, I got out of my car at about 10:30 at night and opened the gate. Then I got back in my car and drove through. I put the car in park to go and close the gate behind me, but I noticed something strange up ahead. Something was catching the light from my headlights. I squinted my eyes and I nearly died when I saw it. Crouching low to the ground and peeking out from behind a tree was a pale, bony, thin figure. Two eyes reflected green from my car's lights. It stood painfully still, staring at me. It was so still that I wasn't entirely sure that it was actually a living thing. I was paralyzed in fear, just waiting and hoping that my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was then the inhuman creature pulled itself back behind the tree. I shoved the car into drive and floored it up the hill. I was so painstakingly afraid as I drove up, especially because the tree, with that thing behind it, was only a few feet from my passenger door as I passed it. I didn't care about the farmers' cows escaping with the gate open. Whatever that thing was, it looked like it had come from my nightmares, and I wasn't about to get out of my car with that thing in the woods. To this day, I don't know what it was. It peered at me from behind the trunk of a thin tree, and when it pulled away, its movements were sickeningly unreal, like a marionette on strings. It happened so fast I didn't get many details save for the shape and color, but I do know it wasn't normal. It wasn't right. It wasn't any animal that roamed these lands that I'd seen before. Thank God I don't live there anymore, and thank God I don't have to open that gate either. Submitted by Baller15. In May 2015, I was 14 years old. It was Memorial Day weekend, so I was invited to go camping with my friends, Will, Matt, and Jake. I'm from St. Louis, so I rarely go hiking, and it was my second time sleeping in a tent outdoors. On Saturday, we went ATV riding on the trail paths, did some airsoft, and did a little fishing. It was around 11 at night when we finished our campfire that we decided to go to bed. We had two tents, one for Will, Jake, and Jake's father, and one for me and Matt. I woke up around 3:30 in the morning to hear rustling, heavy walking, and stuff from the campsite getting knocked around. And I thought maybe someone was up and tired. Well, I thought they were tired, because they probably wouldn't knock stuff around if they were wide awake. The next thing that happened took a huge turn, and it scared the hell out of me. I zipped open the tent window, and to my surprise, it was none of my friends. What I saw was a humanoid figure, 8 to 9 feet tall, hairy, and had wide shoulders. I sat there scared to death, looking at this thing in shock. Matt woke up and asked me what I was doing. I said quietly, "Look over there. What is that?" He was equally freaked out. He replied, "I don't know, man." All of a sudden, it walked over to the other tent and started shaking and pressing on it. I was terrified for my friends. Jake's dad woke up and said, "Whoever that is, stop now." After about 10 seconds, the thing stepped back, 5 huge steps into the tree line. Jake's dad went outside with his gun and flashlight. He shined his light into the tree line. The light reflected 2 glowing eyes almost 9 feet off the ground. He started cursing at it to go away, but all it did was make weird grunting noises and started to move closer. But Jake's dad fired 2 rounds into the trees to fend it off. To our luck, it walked away. The other 2 woke up to the gunshots and asked what had happened. We told them, and they were freaked out, but not half as much as we were. When we saw the first sign of sunlight, we packed up and got the hell out of there, never returning to that area again. We told everyone back at school and home, but they didn't believe us. But 3 people experiencing it, it was better than 1 or even 2. I still get a little scared every now and then, especially when I go in the woods. I try not to think about what would happen if I went outside instead of zipping up that open window. And also if Jake's dad didn't have a gun with him. To this day, I haven't experienced anything else half as strange. This happened a few years ago. I was staying at my sister's house in rural Oregon. She lived right by a big, forested hillside. While I stayed at her house, I usually slept with the windows open because she had a lot of pets, and I have pet allergies. I'm a cat lover though, so the cat would usually sleep in my room regardless. My room was on the 2nd story of the house with the windows facing toward the hillside. The hillside was roughly 50 yards from the actual house, with a small field in between. So one night at around 1 in the morning, I was up on my laptop playing some Warcraft when the cat jumped onto my windowsill and started growling and hissing. Then I heard a very large thing start crashing through the brush on the hillside at a running pace. It was running down the hill and the noise was getting louder. Every time it got to the bottom though, it would run back up. This went on for about 10 minutes. Then, when it reached the bottom another time, I heard what sounded like some kind of animal squealing in pain. It was ear-piercingly loud. At that point the cat stopped growling and ran out of my room, and I just sat there, with my face pressed to the screen on my window, trying to see whatever this thing was. I could hear the bones snapping on whatever it was eating. Then I heard it exit through the brush, and it stepped into the field. The thing was huge. I could feel the vibrations from its feet hitting the ground from the 2nd story of the house, but it had to be about 40 yards away. I still couldn't see it in the darkness, so I went to find my flashlight. Once I found it, I shined it out the window. The thing was in the yard. It was on all 4s and was still pushing about 5 feet tall. It had pale gray blood-covered skin and a bear-like face, but with gaping eyes, and was staring right at me. It snarled its teeth and made a growl. I honestly thought it was going to climb up the fire escape and kill me. I was frozen in fear, just staring at this thing as it took a few more steps toward me. All of a sudden the cat came rushing back into my room and back to the windowsill and growled back at this thing. It glared at the cat for a moment, and then retreated to the hillside, crashing through the brush again on its way back up. I followed it with my flashlight beam, and saw a pair of glowing eyes once it got back to the top, as if it stopped to look back. Then they disappeared. I closed my windows, shut the blinds, and tried getting some sleep, but had nightmares about that thing. The next day, I asked my sister and her husband if they heard or saw anything the night before, and they didn't. I have no idea what that thing could have been, but the fact that I could feel its footsteps made it all too real. It could have easily gotten into that house.
About 3 or 4 years ago, my family moved into an old house. My family consisted of my mother H, stepfather D, my brother In, and my dog Bella and me. I was pretty much alone the day this happened, except for Bella. We were running and playing outside. My backyard is about 3/4 of an acre, and there is a stream that runs behind it. At the end of the fence, there is a small forest. Me and Bella were running around when she started to act off and very protective and was staring at this forest. She started whimpering. This was odd. She nudged me as if to warn me to go back inside. I looked over toward the woods, and I saw the most horrifying thing. I believe it was some sort of creature. I don't know what it was, but there was at least 2 of them. They let out horrible screeching screams. They were both tall and had bloodshot red eyes. They had the faces of dogs with no tails. I don't know what sort of animal or creature these were. You better believe that I got the hell out of there. Me and Bella ran. I could hear them behind us, wanting to give chase. But the clamoring I heard told me that they could not get over the fence. Thank God. We got back into my house and ran up the steps as fast as we could. We locked the doors and sat there. I called my mom and told her what happened. She freaked out and said to make sure the doors and windows are locked in my room and to keep my dog in there. This was the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. Though a short experience. Unknown creatures from the woods. Let's never meet again.